In the sun-bleached fields of Texas, where dreams often wither like summer grass, Jack Miller's calloused hands were all he had left. His small ranch was drowning in debt, the bank's foreclosure notice still fresh on his kitchen table. But fate has a way of testing hearts when they're at their breaking point. On a bitter cold morning, he found her, a dying black Angus calf, abandoned in his back pasture, barely clinging to life. What happened next would become legend in Redemption County, because that calf didn't just belong to anyone. It was the prized breeding heifer of Elena Santos, the reclusive billionaire who'd been searching for something money couldn't buy. Genuine compassion in a world of calculated kindness. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Jack Miller stood at his kitchen window, watching the Texas sunrise paint the sky in shades of amber and rose, just as it had every morning for the 43 years of his life. The coffee in his cup had gone cold, forgotten as he stared at the foreclosure notice that threatened to end 5 generations of Miller ranching legacy. 30 days. That's all the time he had left to make a miracle happen. The old grandfather clock in the corner, his father's pride and joy, ticked away the seconds with the same steady rhythm it had maintained since his childhood. Back then, the Miller Ranch had been something to be proud of. 200 head of cattle, prize-winning bulls, and pastures that stretched as far as the eye could see. Now the barn stood half empty, and the remaining cattle looked almost as tired as he felt. Jack ran his weathered hands through his graying hair, remembering his father's last words 5 years ago. "Son, this land isn't just dirt and grass. It's our family's heart and soul. Promise me you'll keep it alive." He'd made that promise without knowing the drought would stretch on for 3 more years, or that cattle prices would plummet just when he needed them most. Moving to the porch, his boots creaking against the worn wooden boards, Jack surveyed what remained of his heritage. The morning light revealed the harsh reality he faced every day. Fences that needed mending, equipment that was barely holding together, and pastures that had seen better days. The once bustling ranch now echoed with the ghostly memories of better times. His neighbor Tom had offered to buy the place last month. "Before the bank takes it," he'd said with false sympathy. But selling wasn't an option. This wasn't just land. It was where his father had taught him to ride his first horse, where his mother had tended her garden until her last days, where every fence post and barn board held a story of his family's perseverance. The last of his cattle, barely 30 head now, grazed in the distance. Each one represented a desperate hope of survival. But even if he sold them all, it wouldn't be enough to cover what he owed. The bank wanted their money, and they didn't care about family legacies or generations of honest work. Jack pulled out his father's old ledger from the desk drawer, its pages yellow with age and worn from countless hours of careful accounting. His father had survived the oil crisis of the 70s, multiple droughts and market crashes, but he'd never faced the perfect storm of challenges that now threatened to sweep away everything the Millers had built. The morning breeze carried the scent of rain, the first promise of moisture in weeks. Jack closed his eyes and said a silent prayer, just as his father had taught him. In ranching country, hope springs eternal, even when the clouds bring nothing but empty promises. He had 30 days to save his legacy, and he'd fight until the very last second ticked away on that old grandfather clock. Opening his eyes, Jack straightened his shoulders and headed for the barn. There was work to be done, regardless of what tomorrow might bring. The Miller Ranch might be on its last legs, but as long as he drew breath, he'd keep his promise. His father had always said that true character shows not in how a man handles success, but in how he faces adversity. And Jack Miller intended to face this challenge the same way his family had faced every other, with dignity, determination, and an unwavering faith that somehow, some way, tomorrow would bring better days. The morning frost crunched under Jack's boots as he made his way across the back pasture, his breath visible in the pre-dawn air. Something had woken him earlier than usual, a feeling more than a sound, the kind of instinct that every rancher develops after years on the land. The weak cry that caught his ear confirmed his suspicions, but it wasn't coming from his herd. Following the sound, he crossed the southern fence line where the tall grass swayed in the bitter wind. There, curled up in a hollow, lay a black Angus calf. Its coat was slick with frost, body trembling with each labored breath. No brands visible, no tags, just a premium breed calf that shouldn't have been there, fighting for its life in the cold Texas morning. "Hey there, little one," Jack murmured, approaching slowly. The calf's eyes, glazed with fever, tracked his movement. Up close, he could see the signs of severe pneumonia, the ragged breathing, the discharge around its nostrils, the way its sides heaved with each breath. Without immediate care, the animal wouldn't last another day. Jack ran through his mental inventory of supplies. He had some antibiotics left from treating his own herd last spring, barely enough, and using them meant he wouldn't have a backup if his remaining cattle got sick. The sensible thing would be to call the county inspector, report finding the calf, and let them handle it. But as he knelt beside the trembling animal, his father's voice echoed in his memory. "A rancher's duty isn't to what makes sense, it's to what's right." With gentle hands that belied their strength, Jack scooped up the calf. It was a hefty thing, probably a week old, and premium stock from the look of it. Someone somewhere was missing this calf, but right now, that someone wasn't here, and the animal needed help. The walk back to his barn seemed longer than usual, each step careful to avoid jostling his precious cargo. The calf had stopped struggling, either from exhaustion or having sensed his intention to help. Its fever burned against his chest, even through his thick work jacket. Inside the barn, Jack laid the calf on a bed of fresh straw in an empty stall. The space, like too many in his barn nowadays, had been vacant since he'd had to sell off most of his herd. Working quickly, he gathered his medical supplies, the antibiotics, electrolytes, and the last of his vitamin supplements. Each item he pulled from his dwindling stores represented dollars he couldn't spare, but some things were worth more than money. As he administered the first round of treatment, Jack found himself talking to the calf, a habit he'd picked up from his father. "You picked a good morning to need help, little one. I've got nowhere to be except right here." The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, using his last resources to save someone else's cattle while his own ranch teetered on the brink. But as the morning wore on and the calf began responding to the treatment, Jack felt something he hadn't experienced in months. Purpose. Every small improvement, from the calf's strengthening heartbeat to its clearer breathing, reminded him of why he'd become a rancher in the first place. It wasn't about the money. It never had been. It was about being a steward of the land and its creatures, about doing what was right, simply because it was right. By the time the sun had climbed high enough to send shafts of light through the barn's worn roof, Jack had settled into a routine. Every hour, he checked the calf's temperature, adjusted its bedding, and coaxed it to take small amounts of electrolyte-enriched water. The animal's fighting spirit seemed to grow stronger with each passing hour, and Jack found his own determination strengthening alongside it. Maybe saving this calf wouldn't save his ranch, but today, at least, he was still a rancher doing what ranchers do, caring for an animal that needed him, no questions asked. Night fell over the Miller ranch, but Jack hadn't left the barn. He dragged an old cot from the storage room, positioning it next to the calf's stall. The last time he'd used this cot was during his father's final calving season, when they'd stayed up for nights on end, helping their herd bring new life into the world. Now it creaked under his weight as he settled in for what promised to be a long night. The calf's breathing had improved, but the fever still raged. Every few hours, Jack would rouse himself to check its temperature, administer more antibiotics, and encourage it to drink. His own dinner consisted of cold coffee and a sandwich he'd hastily made during one of his trips to the house. The bank statement lay forgotten on his kitchen table. Tonight's problems belonged to the barn. Around midnight, the calf started struggling to stand. Jack watched, heart in his throat, as the animal wobbled on unsteady legs. "Easy there, fighter," he murmured, reaching out to steady it. The calf leaned against his hand, accepting his help without fear. It was a small victory, but in Jack's world, small victories were all he had left. He'd noticed more details about the calf in the hours they'd spent together. The quality of its breeding was evident in every line: the broad chest, the strong bones, the distinctive markings that spoke of careful genetic selection. This wasn't just any black Angus. This was top-tier stock, worth more than most of his remaining herd combined. Somewhere out there was a rancher with deep pockets and probably a frantic search underway. Dawn broke with another small miracle. The calf had started showing interest in feeding. Jack had prepared a bottle of milk replacer, using the last of his supply. As he watched the calf nurse with growing strength, his mind wandered to the bitter irony of his situation. Here he was, pouring his last resources into saving a valuable animal that would probably return to some wealthy rancher's herd, while his own legacy slipped through his fingers. But looking at the calf's eyes, now clearer and more alert, Jack couldn't bring himself to regret his decision. His father had always said that a man's worth wasn't measured by what he had, but by what he gave when he had nothing left to give. By that measure, maybe he wasn't such a failure after all. The morning sun brought Tom Henderson, his neighbor, driving past the fence line in his shiny new truck. Jack could see him slow down, probably wondering why there was activity in the barn that had been quiet for so long. Tom had been circling like a vulture since the bank's notice arrived, making no secret of his plans to absorb the Miller land into his own expanding operation. Let him wonder, Jack thought. Some things were still none of Tom Henderson's business. The calf was sleeping now, its breathing steady and strong. Jack allowed himself a small smile as he ran his hand along its back, feeling the fever finally breaking under his touch. "You're a fighter, all right," he whispered. "Guess we both needed a win, didn't we?" He pulled out his father's old veterinary manual, its pages dog-eared and stained from years of use. His father had taught him everything he knew about caring for cattle, passing down knowledge that went beyond what any book could contain. Those lessons were coming in handy now, as he monitored the calf's recovery with the practiced eye of someone who'd been reading livestock since before he could read words. By midday, Jack had to admit that the transformation was remarkable. The calf that had been barely clinging to life 24 hours ago was now alert, responsive, and even playful. It had started butting against his leg during his checks, a sign of returning strength that made his heart lighter despite his exhaustion. The sound of approaching vehicles caught his attention, probably the mail carrier with more bills he couldn't pay, but that could wait. Right now, in this barn with this recovering calf, Jack had found something he thought he'd lost: hope. It might not last beyond today, but for now, it was enough to keep his own head held high, even as the world outside threatened to come crashing down around him. The crunch of tires on gravel drew Jack's attention away from the recovering calf. Through the barn's open door, he spotted a modest pickup truck he didn't recognize, dusty from the county roads and at least a decade old. A woman in worn jeans and a faded work shirt stepped out, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She moved with the confident ease of someone who knew her way around a ranch, but Jack had never seen her before. "Morning," she called out, approaching the barn. "Word around town is you found a stray calf." Her voice carried a slight accent he couldn't quite place, her brown eyes taking in everything with keen intelligence. Jack straightened up, wiping his hands on his jeans. "News travels fast," he replied, studying her carefully. Something about her didn't quite fit with her rough appearance, though he couldn't put his finger on what. "I work for several ranches in the area," she explained, introducing herself as Elena Reyes. "We've got a few operations missing cattle. Mind if I take a look?" Jack gestured toward the stall where the calf rested. "Found it yesterday morning." No tags or brands. Premium stock, though. Someone's probably worried sick. Elena moved to the stall with practiced ease, but Jack noticed how the calf responded to her presence, not with the usual wariness of a stranger, but with familiar interest. She knelt beside it, her inspection thorough and professional, though her hands seemed too smooth for someone who claimed to work ranch duties. "You've done an impressive job," she commented, noting the medical supplies and empty bottles. "Most would have called the county inspector straight away." Jack shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "Couldn't leave it to suffer. Used the last of my supplies, but—" He trailed off, realizing he was saying too much to a stranger. Elena's eyes flickered to the empty medicine bottles, then back to him. Must have been expensive, treating someone else's cattle when times are hard. It wasn't a question. She'd clearly heard about his situation too. "Doing what's right isn't about counting the cost," Jack replied, echoing his father's words, though the bank might disagree with that philosophy. He added the last part with a bitter smile. Elena spent the next hour asking detailed questions about the calf's treatment, each answer seeming to interest her more than the last. She took notes in a small leather notebook that looked too expensive for a ranch hand, another detail that nagged at Jack's instincts. As the afternoon sun began to slant through the barn windows, Eleanor stood to leave. "You've impressed a lot of people, Mr. Miller," she said cryptically. "More than you know." Before he could respond, she was already walking back to her truck. Jack watched her drive away, unable to shake the feeling that something significant had just happened. The calf mooed softly behind him, and he turned back to his patient, pushing his questions aside. Whatever game was being played, he had more immediate concerns, like making his last bale of hay last another week. The next morning brought another visitor to the Miller Ranch, but this time there was no dusty pickup truck. A sleek black SUV with tinted windows pulled up to the barn, followed by two more identical vehicles. Jack straightened from where he'd been tending the calf, his guard immediately up. The morning sun glinted off the expensive cars, so out of place among his weathered buildings that they seemed almost otherworldly. When Elena stepped out, she was transformed. Gone were the worn jeans and work shirt, replaced by a tailored business suit that probably cost more than his monthly mortgage. Her hair was elegantly styled, and she carried herself with the unmistakable authority of someone used to commanding rooms full of executives. "Mr. Miller," she said, her voice the same, but somehow different, more confident, more refined. "I believe I owe you an explanation." Jack's mind raced back to yesterday's encounter, pieces falling into place. "You're not a ranch hand," he stated flatly. "No," she admitted with a slight smile. "I'm Elena Santos, owner of Santos Agricultural Enterprises." She paused, letting the name sink in. Even Jack, isolated as he was in his struggle to save his ranch, knew that name. Santos Agricultural was the largest cattle operation in Texas, with holdings that made his entire ranch look like a backyard garden. "That calf," she continued, walking toward the stall, "is Midnight Star's latest offspring, a $1 million breeding line we've developed over 3 generations. When she went missing during transport, I launched a quiet search, but I was looking for more than just the calf." Jack followed her gaze to the animal, now strong enough to stand and greet its true owner. "You were testing people," he realized aloud, seeing who would do the right thing. Elena nodded, turning to face him fully. "In my world, Mr. Miller, genuine character is rarer than premium bloodlines. I've watched ranchers with thousands of acres ignore suffering animals because helping wasn't profitable. Then I find you using your last resources to save a stranger's calf while your own ranch faces foreclosure." "I don't need charity," Jack said stiffly, his pride rising despite his desperate situation. "I'm not offering charity," Elena replied sharply. "I'm offering an investment in you, in this ranch, in the kind of values that built this industry and are now vanishing faster than Texas water tables." She pulled out a folder from her briefcase. "I want to make you a partner, Mr. Miller. Your land, your expertise, my resources. Together, Jack stared at the folder she held out, his father's voice echoing in his head about Miller pride and self-reliance. But another memory surfaced. His father teaching him that sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is accept help when it's honestly offered. "Why?" he asked finally. "You could buy 10 ranches like mine without blinking." Elena's professional mask softened slightly. "Because this industry needs more men like you, Mr. Miller, because that calf isn't the only thing worth saving here." She gestured around at his ranch. "I'm offering you a chance to preserve your legacy and help me remember mine. The decision is yours." The sound of the grandfather clock drifted from the house, counting seconds that suddenly felt heavy with possibility. Jack looked at his father's barn, at the land his family had worked for generations, and at the calf that had somehow brought him to this crossroads. Sometimes, he realized, miracles don't look like what you expect. The folder Elena had left sat unopened on Jack's kitchen table, casting a long shadow in the fading evening light. He'd been staring at it for hours, the grandfather clock's steady ticking marking time like a countdown to Judgment Day. His coffee had gone cold again, untouched, like the dinner he'd tried to make himself eat. Every time he reached for the folder, his father's words rang in his ears. "A miller stands on his own 2 feet." But then he'd look out the window at his struggling ranch, at the empty pastures that should have been full of cattle, and wonder if standing alone was worth losing everything his family had built. The phone rang, startling him from his thoughts. It was the bank, 3rd time this week. Jack let it go to voicemail, already knowing what they'd say. 28 days left. The number hung in his mind like a noose, tightening with each passing hour. He finally pulled the folder closer, his calloused fingers leaving smudges on the expensive paper. Inside, the proposal was laid out in clear, professional terms. Elena Santos wasn't offering a buyout, she was proposing a true partnership. The Miller Ranch would keep its name, its identity, but with the full backing of Santos Agricultural's resources. The foreclosure would be handled, the debts cleared, and most surprisingly, Jack would retain majority control of his land. Rising from the table, Jack walked to the old photographs that lined his living room walls. 5 generations of Millers stared back at him, each one having faced their own challenges, their own hard choices. His great-grandfather had survived the Dust Bowl, his grandfather the Great Depression. His father had weathered market crashes and droughts. None of them had faced exactly this choice, though. The sound of his boots on the porch boards seemed louder than usual as he stepped outside into the night air. The stars were out in force, spreading across the Texas sky like spilled diamonds. His father used to say you could find answers in those stars if you looked hard enough. "What would you do, Dad?" he whispered to the night. "When does holding on become holding back?" A soft moo from the barn caught his attention. The rescued calf, now strong enough to make its presence known. Jack walked over, each step heavy with thought. The animal greeted him eagerly, pressing against the stall door. Here was living proof of what cooperation could achieve. He couldn't have saved this calf without the medical supplies his father had taught him to use, just as he couldn't have gained that knowledge without his father's willingness to teach. Maybe, he realized, that was the key. His father hadn't stood alone. He'd stood on the foundation built by previous generations, just as he'd built a foundation for Jack. Pride was one thing, but wasn't there pride, too, in being wise enough to adapt, to ensure the legacy continued, even if the path forward looked different than expected? Jack pulled out his phone, looking at the number Elena had left. The calf nudged his hand, as if offering encouragement. In the distance, a coyote called out, its voice carrying across the empty pastures that could be full again. 28 days wasn't much time to save a legacy, but maybe that's why the opportunity had come now, when he had just enough time to swallow his pride and make the right choice. His finger hovered over the call button. Sometimes, he thought, the hardest part of keeping a promise isn't the work you put in. It's being brave enough to accept help when that's what the promise needs. The Miller Ranch would survive, But maybe it was time for it to do more than just survive. Maybe it was time for it to grow in ways his father never could have imagined, but would have understood. Dawn broke over a Miller ranch that was already humming with activity. A fleet of trucks had arrived at first light, carrying everything from construction materials to state-of-the-art farming equipment. Jack stood on his porch, coffee cup in hand, watching as Elena directed the operation with military precision. 1 week into their partnership, and his world had turned upside down. "We'll start with the barn restoration," Elena called out, walking up to join him. She'd found a middle ground in her appearance now. Designer jeans and a quality work shirt that managed to look both practical and expensive. "Your father's design was actually quite innovative. We'll keep the basic structure but reinforce it with modern materials." Jack nodded, trying to hide his discomfort at the pace of change. "Dad built that barn to last through anything Texas could throw at it." "And it has," Elena agreed, surprising him. "That's why we're not tearing it down. Good bones deserve respect." She handed him a tablet showing the renovation plans. But even good bones can use some support. The plans revealed something Jack hadn't expected, a perfect blend of old and new. The barn's classic structure would remain, but with updated ventilation, automated feeding systems, and solar panels discreetly integrated into the new roof. It was as if someone had taken his father's dreams and given them modern wings. Throughout the morning, Jack found himself repeatedly surprised by Elena's hands-on approach. She didn't just direct, she worked alongside everyone else, not afraid to get her hands dirty. When one of the workers questioned the placement of a support beam, she climbed up herself to demonstrate why the original design needed to be preserved. "You know your stuff," Jack commented during their lunch break, watching her study his father's old blueprints with genuine interest. "I grew up on a ranch too," she revealed, tracing the pencil lines with her finger. "Smaller than this one. My father died when I was young, but not before teaching me that success in ranching isn't just about money. It's about understanding the land, the animals, and the people who work it." A comfortable silence fell between them as they ate sandwiches. In the shade of an old oak tree, the sound of construction mixed with the familiar noises of ranch life, cattle lowing, birds calling, the Texas wind sweeping across the plains. It should have felt jarring, this collision of old and new, but somehow it didn't. The rescued calf, now fully recovered, grazed nearby with the small herd of premium cattle Elena had brought in. Jack watched it move among its new companions, adapted but still distinct. Maybe that's what this partnership could be, not a replacement of the old way, but an evolution of it. As the afternoon wore on, Jack found himself sharing more of his own ideas, innovations he dreamed up during late nights but never had the resources to implement. Elena listened intently, occasionally adding her own suggestions or pulling up relevant research on her tablet. They were speaking the same language, he realized, just with different dialects. By sunset, the barn's transformation was well underway, and Jack could see the ghost of his father's vision taking new shape in the modern additions. The day's work had left him tired, but with a different kind of ache than he was used to. Not the desperate fatigue of fighting a losing battle, but the honest exhaustion of building something new. Elena paused at her car, looking back at the progress they'd made. "Your father would be proud," she said softly, then added with a smile. "But tomorrow we tackle those irrigation systems you mentioned. I think you're onto something there." As he watched her drive away, Jack felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Excitement about the future. The Miller Ranch was still his, still carried his family's legacy. But now it had room to grow in ways he'd never imagined possible. Elena arrived earlier than usual that morning, finding Jack already at work in what she'd started calling his innovation shed, a small building behind the main barn that housed his makeshift workshop. He was so absorbed in his project that he didn't hear her approach, giving her a moment to observe him unnoticed. Spread across his workbench were detailed drawings of an irrigation system unlike anything she'd seen before. Jack's design incorporated rainwater harvesting and soil moisture sensors, but with a unique twist that made her eyes widen in recognition of its brilliance. He'd figured out a way to reduce water consumption by nearly 40% while improving distribution, something her own engineers had been struggling with for months. "How long have you been working on this?" she asked, making her presence known. Jack started slightly, then shrugged. "Been tinkering with it for years. Never had the means to build it properly, but the theory's sound." He ran a hand through his hair, leaving a smudge of dirt across his forehead. "During the worst of the drought, I spent every spare minute trying to figure out how to make each drop of water count." Elena picked up one of the drawings, studying it intently. "This isn't just tinkering, Jack. This is revolutionary. The way you've designed the pressure distribution system." She traced the lines with her finger. "We have a whole R&D department working on similar concepts, but they haven't come close to this elegance." A flush crept up Jack's neck at her. "Praise. Just practical solutions to real problems. Nothing fancy about it." "No," Elena said firmly. "This is exactly what I was hoping to find when I proposed this partnership." She laid the drawing down and looked him straight in the eye. "You understand ranching at a bone-deep level, Jack. You don't just see problems, you see solutions that people with all the money and education in the world miss because they've never had to make do with less." Their eyes met for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them. It was Elena who finally looked away first, turning back to the drawings with a businesslike air that didn't quite hide her flustered expression. "We need to patent this," she said, her voice professional, but warm. "And I want you to present it at the Texas Agricultural Innovation Conference next month." "Present?" Jack's face paled. "Elena, I don't do presentations. I'm just a rancher." "You're not just anything," she replied softly. Then more, briskly. "Besides, who better to explain it than the person who invented it? These people need to hear from someone who's lived the reality of modern ranching, not just studied it." As they spent the rest of the morning going over his other innovations, designs for more efficient feed systems, a method for tracking cattle health using observation of behavioral patterns, and a dozen other practical improvements, Jack found himself seeing his years of tinkering through new eyes. What he'd dismissed as just getting by, Elena saw as valuable innovations. The ranch hands Elena had hired were starting to arrive for the day's work, and through the window Jack could see them gathering near the main barn. But for just a moment longer, he and Elena remained in the workshop, surrounded by his drawings and dreams that suddenly seemed a lot more possible than they had yesterday. "You know," Elena said, gathering up the drawings carefully, "I think we just might be changing. More than just this ranch." She paused at the door, looking back at him with a smile that made his heart skip a beat. Partner. The word hung in the air between them, carrying more weight than either of them was ready to acknowledge. Jack watched her walk toward the main barn, her confident stride somehow different than usual, less CEO, more fellow dreamer. Maybe, he thought, they were both discovering something unexpected in this partnership. Word traveled fast in ranching country. 3 weeks into the partnership between Miller Ranch and Santos Agricultural, and it seemed everyone in 3 counties had an opinion about it. Jack felt the stares every time he went into town. Some curious, some envious, some downright hostile. The local diner, where he'd eaten breakfast every Sunday for the past 20 years, had become uncomfortably quiet when he walked in. Old friends who used to greet him warmly now gave him cautious nods, as if they weren't quite sure who he was anymore. "Heard you're putting in them fancy automated systems," Bill Cooper, owner of the hardware store, commented one morning. "Guess the old ways aren't good enough anymore, huh?" Before Jack could respond, a smooth voice cut in. "Actually, we're implementing Jack's designs. Did you know he developed a water conservation system that could save every ranch in this county thousands of dollars a year?" Elena had appeared beside him, her presence both commanding and deliberately casual. Bill's expression shifted from skepticism to surprise. "Jack's designs?" Every major improvement we're making started in that workshop of his," Elena continued, picking up the supplies they'd come for. "The Miller Ranch isn't changing its soul. It's finally getting the chance to show what it can do." On the drive back to the ranch, Jack glanced at Elena. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did," she replied firmly. "These are your innovations." "Jack, don't let anyone make you feel ashamed of success just because it looks different than they expected." Back at the ranch, the transformation was becoming more visible every day. The new barn gleamed in the sunlight, solar panels catching the light. The first section of Jack's irrigation system was operational, and the results were already exceeding expectations. The herd had grown, a careful mix of his remaining cattle and Elena's premium stock creating something unique. But not everyone was impressed. Tom Henderson had taken to parking his truck at the fence line almost daily, watching the progress with narrowed eyes. Jack knew that look. Tom had been counting on buying the Miller land cheap when the bank foreclosed. Now he was watching that opportunity slip away, and he wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully. "He's been asking questions around town," Elena mentioned one afternoon as they reviewed the weekly progress reports. "About our partnership agreement, about the legality of the timing." Jack's jaw tightened. "Tom's always wanted this land. His daddy tried to buy it from my daddy 30 years ago. Elena's hand brushed his arm lightly. "He can ask all the questions he wants. Everything we've done is solid." She paused, studying his face. "Are you having second thoughts?" "No," Jack answered without hesitation, surprising himself with how true it was. "This is still Miller Ranch, just more than it was. Dad always said the land had potential. He just never had the chance to prove it." They stood together at the window of his father's old office, now updated with modern equipment, but still holding the same worn desk, the same family photos on the walls. Outside, ranch hands, both old and new, worked together. The distinction between Santos agricultural employees and Miller Ranch workers fading more each day. "You know," Elena said softly, "when I first proposed this partnership, I thought I was just saving a piece of ranching history. I didn't expect—" She trailed off, their reflections in the window standing close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "Didn't expect what?" Jack asked, turning to face her. But before she could answer, a commotion erupted outside. Tom Henderson's truck was peeling away from the fence line, and one of the new fence sections had been torn down, cattle already. Moving toward the gap, the moment broken, they sprung into action. Yet as they hurried outside together, Jack couldn't help but wonder about Elena's unfinished sentence, even as he tried to ignore the way his heart had started beating faster in that quiet moment by the window. The story broke in the State Agriculture Journal. Billionaire's latest acquisition, historic family ranch. The headline made Jack's stomach turn. Beneath it was a photo of Elena leaving the ranch, caught by some photographer hiding in the brush, like a coyote. The article painted their partnership as a calculated corporate takeover, twisting every positive change into something sinister. Local rancher Jack Miller, whose family has worked the land for 5 generations, has surrendered. "Control to agricultural mogul Elena Santos," Jack read aloud, his voice tight with anger. He was sitting in Elena's Houston office, where she'd called him urgently after the article went live. Elena paced behind her desk, her usual composure cracking. "It's not just the article. Someone's been feeding information to the press. Details. About our partnership, twisted versions of private conversations. The timing's too perfect to be coincidence." "Tom Henderson," Jack said grimly. "He's trying to turn the community against us." "Against me," Elena corrected softly. "They're painting me as the corporate villain who swept in to steal your heritage." She stopped pacing, looking out over the Houston skyline. "Maybe we should have seen this coming." The contrast between this sleek office and his ranch couldn't have been starker. Here, Elena was every inch the powerful CEO, surrounded by the trappings of corporate success. Jack felt out of place in his work boots and ranch-worn jeans, like a prop in someone else's play. The Agricultural Innovation Conference called, Elena continued, not meeting his eyes. They're suggesting we postpone your presentation. They're concerned about controversy. Jack felt the sting of that deeply. His irrigation system design, his chance to prove himself as more than just a struggling rancher, all potentially derailed by gossip and spite. So we let them win, let them shame us into hiding? No, Elena turned sharply, but we need to be strategic. The media's painting this as a David and Goliath story, with you as the naive David who doesn't realize he's being exploited. That's ridiculous, Jack stood, frustration boiling over. Anyone who's seen the ranch, seen what we're building together— Have you read your messages today? Elena interrupted, her voice gentler now. Your cousin Sarah posted quite a passionate defense of your father's legacy on social media. She seems to think I'm destroying it. Jack hadn't checked his phone since the story broke. Now he pulled it out, scrolling through dozens of messages from family members he hadn't heard from in years, all suddenly concerned about the Miller Ranch's future. Sarah's post was particularly painful. She'd shared childhood photos of them, with his father lamenting how he'd sold out their heritage. The board's concerned, Elena admitted quietly. They're suggesting we scale back the partnership, make it look more like a traditional investment arrangement, less personal. The word hung between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. The past. Weeks had blurred lines that perhaps should have stayed clear. Every shared sunset, every late-night planning session, every moment when their hands had brushed reaching for the same document. They'd been building something beyond a business. Partnership, and they both knew it. So what do you want to do? Jack asked, his voice rough. Elena finally turned to face him fully, her professional mask slipping to reveal genuine conflict. I want, she started, then caught herself. What I want doesn't matter. We need to think about what's best for the ranch, for your family's legacy. Before Jack could respond, her assistant buzzed in. More reporters were calling, and the board wanted an emergency meeting. The real world was intruding, demanding decisions. I'll have my driver take you back to the ranch, Elena said, her CEO persona sliding back into place. We'll talk more once things settle down. Jack watched her transform back into Elena Santos, agricultural mogul, and felt something precious slipping away. As he left her office, he couldn't help wondering if Tom Henderson had managed to destroy something far more valuable than just a business partnership. The Miller Ranch felt different when Jack returned from Houston. The same work continued, hands tending cattle, construction crews finishing the barn's modernization, his irrigation system operating smoothly. But something had changed. Or maybe he had changed, seeing it all through the lens of that damning article. Elena hadn't come to the ranch in 3 days, sending her operations manager instead. The man was competent but cold, carrying a revised partnership agreement that read more like a corporate acquisition. Jack had left it unsigned on his desk, unable to bring himself to look at it again. On the 4th day, Tom Henderson made his move. He called a community meeting at the local church, officially to discuss agricultural preservation, but really to air his grievances about the Santos-Miller partnership. Jack hadn't planned to attend until he heard Elena would be there, representing her company's interests. The church was packed when he arrived. Faces he'd known all his life turned to watch him enter. Elena sat near the front, surrounded by her corporate team, looking every inch the successful businesswoman. She didn't turn when he walked in, though he saw her shoulders tense. Tom Henderson stood at the pulpit, his voice carrying with false concern. We're here because we care about our community's future, about preserving our way of life against corporate takeovers that strip away our heritage for profit. Jack watched Elena's back stiffen, but she remained composed, even as Tom detailed his evidence of Santos Agricultural's pattern of acquiring and transforming family farms. The facts were technically true, but twisted. ignoring the failing state of those farms before Elena's involvement, overlooking how many families still worked their own land under her company's partnership. And now, Tom continued, his voice heavy, with fake sympathy, they've set their sights on the Miller Ranch, 5 generations of Miller blood and sweat being erased for corporate profit. That's not true. Jack's voice cut through the murmurs, stronger than he'd intended. He stood, facing the crowd. Nobody's erasing anything. Really? Tom challenged. Is that why there are solar panels on your daddy's barn? Why there's talk of your land being used to test corporate farming techniques? Tell me, Jack, what would your father think of his son, turning his life's work into a corporate experiment? The words hit hard, but before Jack could respond, Elena stood. Mr. Henderson, her voice was steel wrapped in silk, you seem very concerned about the Miller legacy. Where was this concern when the bank was about to foreclose, when Jack was struggling to keep his herd fed during the drought? She turned to face the crowd. You want to talk about heritage? Jack Miller has developed farming innovations that could save every ranch in this room, but he couldn't implement them without resources. Resources none of you offered to provide. You were all happy to watch his ranch fail as long as it failed traditionally. The silence in the church was deafening. Jack stared at Elena, seeing not the corporate CEO, but the woman who'd recognized his potential when everyone else had written him off. But then her corporate team surrounded her, whispering urgently, and he watched her facade crack for just a moment before hardening again. The revised agreement, she said, not looking at him, will ensure the Miller Ranch maintains its traditional character while benefiting from our company's support. All operations will be overseen by our management team to protect both parties' interests. And just like that, the woman who'd worked beside him in the barn, who'd believed in his innovations, who'd started to become something more than a business partner, disappeared behind corporate protocol. Jack felt something inside him break. No, he said quietly, but his voice carried in the silent church. That's not what we built this partnership on. That's not what we... He trailed off, the unspoken things between them hanging in the air. Elena finally met his eyes, and for a moment he saw everything they'd both been afraid to acknowledge. Then she looked away, back to her corporate team, back to the safe distance of business relationships and managed risks. Jack walked out of the church without another word, the weight of his father's legacy and his own dreams crushing down on him with each step. Behind him, he heard Tom Henderson's satisfied voice resuming his speech, but he couldn't make out the words over the sound of his own heart breaking. Jack was in his workshop, methodically dismantling the prototype of his latest irrigation design, when Maria, one of his oldest ranch hands, burst in. Her face was flushed with a mixture of anger and urgency. "You need to see this," she said, thrusting her tablet at him. On the screen was a leaked email chain from Santos Agricultural, dated months before Elena had ever appeared at his ranch. His eyes caught fragments that made his blood run cold. Miller Ranch, perfect for pilot program. Owner's financial distress makes acquisition optimal. Staged discovery of test subject, calf, to assess character. Recommend proceeding with Operation Legacy. The tablet shook in his hands as he scrolled through message after message, each one revealing more of the calculated plan. The lost calf hadn't been an accident. Elena's appearance as a ranch hand, her discovery of his innovations, even the timing of the bank's pressure. It had all been orchestrated. "There's more," Maria said quietly. "Tom Henderson didn't find this on his own. Someone inside Santos Agricultural leaked it to him. As if summoned by the revelation, the sound of Elena's car coming up the drive cut through the morning air. Jack placed the tablet down with careful precision, the way his father had taught him to handle something that might shatter. Elena appeared in the workshop doorway, her face pale but determined. One look at him, at Maria's protective stance beside him, and understanding dawned in her eyes. "You know, how long?" Jack's voice was sandpaper rough. "How long were you watching my ranch fail before you decided it was time to swoop in and save it?" 6 months, she admitted, not trying to deny it. But Jack, you don't understand. I understand plenty, he cut her off. I understand you found a struggling rancher with land you wanted and innovations you could use. I understand you staged that whole scene with the calf to test if I was, what, worthy of your grand experiment? Elena stepped forward, but stopped when Maria shifted protectively closer to Jack. Yes, I had my company watching your ranch. Yes, I orchestrated our first meeting, but everything that happened after was part of the plan, Jack finished. Build my trust, make me feel like a partner instead of a pilot program. Tell me, Elena, was there anything real? Or was it all just corporate strategy? The calf was real, she said softly. We were transporting her, and she really did get sick. I could have had her treated at any of our facilities, but I chose to see what you would do. Not for data, not for some corporate experiment. I needed to know if you were the kind of person I thought you were. The kind of person you could use, Jack corrected bitterly. The kind of person I could trust. Eleanor's composure cracked. Do you know how many ranchers I've tried to help? How many took the money and ran, or refused to innovate, or tried to scam my company? I needed someone who understood both the old ways and the need for change. Someone with vision and integrity. So you manipulated me, watched my ranch fail until the timing was perfect. I watched you fight impossible odds with innovation and determination. I saw someone who could help me change ranching for the better, who could prove that progress doesn't have to mean losing our heritage. She took another step forward. Everything in those emails, that was business. But what happened between us was business too, Jack said quietly. Just better executed. And then I realized. He turned away, picking up his wrench again. I'd like you to leave now. Jack, please, get out. The wrench clattered against his workbench. Take your corporate strategies and your pilot programs and get off my ranch. Elena stood for a moment longer, and Jack could feel her eyes on him. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. For what it's worth, I didn't plan on falling in love with you. By the time he turned around, she was gone. Jack stared at the empty doorway, the sound of her car fading into the distance. Maria placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, but he shrugged it off, turning back to his dismantled irrigation system. The truth lay scattered around him like the pieces of his prototype, a masterpiece of manipulation that had caught his heart, as thoroughly as it had captured his ranch, and he had no idea how to rebuild from here. The next week passed in a blur of legal documents and corporate communications. Elena's company lawyers sent notice that they would honor all financial commitments but would transition to a hands-off investment role. The Miller Ranch would keep its improvements and funding, but the partnership, both professional and personal, was over. Jack spent his days mechanically going through the motions of ranch work, nights staring at the ceiling of his father's house, replaying every moment, with Elena wondering how he'd missed the signs. The rescued calf, now thriving, watched him with those same trusting eyes that had first drawn him in, unaware it had been part of an elaborate corporate strategy. In Houston, Elena sat in her corner office, surrounded by the trappings of success, that suddenly felt hollow. Her assistant had stopped trying to get her to attend board meetings or respond to press inquiries. Instead, she found herself watching the Miller Ranch's security feeds, a corporate oversight tool she'd never admitted to Jack existed. Through the cameras, she watched him working alone in his workshop late into the night. He'd resumed developing his innovations, but now they bore a harsh edge of determination, as if he were trying to prove something to her, to himself, to the memory of his father. She couldn't tell anymore. The leaked emails sat on her desk. There, corporate language so cold and calculated now. Operation Legacy. How had she ever thought that was an acceptable way to describe what she'd done? She'd approached Jack's ranch like every other business opportunity in her life, with strategy and careful planning. But somewhere between the spreadsheets and status reports, she'd forgotten she was dealing with people's lives, their dreams, their hearts. Back at the ranch, Jack discovered that Elena's corporate team had left behind all his original designs, annotated with detailed suggestions for improvements. Her handwriting filled the margins, not corporate feedback, but genuine enthusiasm and understanding. He'd started to crumple the papers, then stopped, seeing the date on one note. It was from their first week together, long before he'd begun to trust her. Her excitement about his ideas had been real. Even then, Tom Henderson showed up at his gate, wearing a sympathetic smile that didn't reach his eyes. Heard the news about Santos pulling back. You know, my offer to buy still stands. Better to sell to a neighbor than let it become another corporate statistic. Jack looked at his longtime neighbor, seeing clearly for the first time the same calculating nature he'd accused Elena of. The Miller Ranch isn't for sale, Tom. Not now, not ever. Don't be proud, Jack. We both know you can't maintain all these fancy improvements without corporate backing. It's just a matter of time before... Before what? Jack cut him off. Before I prove that a family ranch can innovate and succeed. That's what really bothers you, isn't it? Not Elena's company, but the fact that we were making it work. Tom's face darkened. She really got to you, didn't she? Made you forget who you are, where you come from? No, Jack said quietly. She helped me remember. My father didn't just teach me to maintain tradition, he taught me to think, to solve problems, to adapt. Elena may have had her own agenda, but she saw something in this ranch that everyone else missed, including me. As Tom drove away in a cloud of dust, Jack stood looking over his land. The modernized barn gleamed in the sunset. His irrigation system hummed efficiently. The cattle grazed on healthier pastures. Elena's manipulation had brought him here, but what he'd built since then, what they'd built together, was real. The question was, what would he do with that truth? The weather alert blared across every phone in Redemption County. A severe storm system was bearing down on central Texas, bringing with it the threat of flash floods and high winds. Jack stood on his porch, watching the approaching wall of black clouds, his years of ranching experience telling him this was going to be bad. The modernized weather monitoring system Elena had installed, still functioning despite their broken partnership, was spitting out warnings faster than he could process them. The nearby creek that fed his innovative irrigation system was rising at an alarming rate, threatening to overflow its carefully engineered banks. His ranch hands were already moving cattle to higher ground when a familiar black SUV came speeding up the drive. Elena jumped out before it had fully stopped, her corporate polish forgotten in favor of practical ranch wear. "You shouldn't be here," Jack said, even as relief flooded through him at the sight of her. "Your ranch is still under Santos Agricultural." "Insurance," she replied, all business despite the emotion in her eyes. "I'm not letting corporate politics destroy everything we built." A crack of thunder punctuated her words, and the sky opened up. Rain pounded the earth with brutal force as they raced to the barn. Inside, they found Maria coordinating with the remaining ranch hands, her face grave. "The new drainage system is overwhelmed," she reported, "and the creek's rising faster than the models predicted. We've got 30 minutes, maybe less, before it breaches the lower pasture." Elena pulled out her tablet, fingers flying over the screen. "I'm redirecting our emergency response teams from Houston. They can be here in 2 hours, Jack finished. "Too late." He met her eyes, setting aside their personal conflict. "The immediate threat isn't the creek. It's the runoff from the North Ridge. If it hits the new irrigation channels before we can redirect them, the whole system could burst," Elena realized, taking out the foundation of the new barn and the lower corrals with it. They moved as one, falling back into the seamless partnership that had made them so effective before everything fell apart. Jack coordinated the hands to begin emergency drainage procedures, while Elena accessed the automated systems, trying to reroute water flow through secondary channels. The storm raged around them as they worked, wind howling through the barn's reinforced walls. Through the rain-streaked windows, they could see the creek rising, hungry for land it hadn't touched in generations. "Jack!" Maria's voice carried over the storm. The cattle in the east pasture, they're spooked by the storm. Breaking through. The fences, including the rescued calf, now a strong young heifer that had started everything. Jack saw Elena's head snap up, saw the same thought cross her mind. Without a word, they both rushed for the barn doors. "You don't have to do this," Jack shouted over the wind. "It's not your responsibility anymore." Elena's hair was plastered to her face by the rain, but her eyes were clear and determined. "It never was about responsibility, Jack. I thought I could plan and control everything. The ranch, the partnership, you, but some things can't be controlled. They can only be lived." Another lightning strike illuminated the ranch, showing them the full scope of what they stood to lose. Not just the land and cattle, but something far more precious that had grown between them, despite all the corporate strategies and careful plans. The creek rose higher, thunder crashed overhead, and they faced the storm together, neither one sure if they were trying to save just the ranch or something more. The rain had turned the east pasture into a muddy battleground. Jack and Elena fought their way through the storm on horseback, following the panicked bellows of the scattered cattle. Lightning flashed overhead, sending another wave of terror. He threw the herd. "There!" Elena pointed through the deluge. The rescued heifer, now nearly full-grown, was leading a group of younger cattle dangerously close to the rising creek. The same creek that had started everything, now threatening to end it all. They split up without needing to discuss it, their months of working together creating an unspoken understanding. Jack circled wide to the left, while Elena took the right, their horses struggling against the wind and mud. The creek roared beside them, swollen beyond recognition. "Like old times," Elena called out as they maneuvered to herd the cattle back toward safety. Despite everything, Jack felt a smile tug at his lips. This was the Elena he'd come to know, not the corporate CEO, but the rancher's daughter who'd never forgotten her roots. A massive crack of thunder sent the cattle into another panic. The heifer broke away from the group, charging toward the creek's unstable bank. Elena spurred her horse after it without hesitation. "Elena, wait!" Jack's warning came too late. The rain-softened ground crumbled under her horse's hooves. For one terrible moment, Jack watched both rider and mount slide toward the raging water. He didn't remember dismounting or crossing the distance between them. One moment, he was watching in horror. The next, he was pulling Elena from the mud while her horse scrambled back to solid ground. They ended up together on the soggy earth, rain pounding around them, her hands gripping his shirt. "You could have been killed," he said roughly, his heart still racing. "Couldn't let her go," Elena gasped, referring to the heifer that had now rejoined the other cattle. "She brought us together once. Couldn't let her tear us apart." "It wasn't the calf that tore us apart." Jack helped her to her feet, but didn't let go of her hand. "Why didn't you just tell me the truth from the beginning?" Elena's hair was plastered to her face, but her eyes were clear as she looked at him. "Because I've spent so long thinking everything has to be strategized, controlled, managed. My father died when our small ranch failed, and I promised myself I'd never be that vulnerable again. So I built walls, made plans, turned everything into business decisions." A loud crash from the direction of the barn interrupted them. They turned to see the creek threatening to breach its banks near the new storage facilities. "We need to redirect the water flow," Jack said, already moving. "The main control panel is in your workshop," Elena finished. They ran together through the storm, reaching the workshop just as another lightning strike illuminated the ranch. Inside, Jack's innovations surrounded them. The designs Elena had first pretended to discover now improved through their collaboration. Jack's fingers flew over the control panel, adjusting water flow rates, while Elena monitored pressure levels on her tablet. They worked in perfect sync, as if the weeks of separation had never happened. "I had a plan," Elena said suddenly, her voice barely audible over the storm. "A perfect, corporate-approved strategy to save struggling ranches while modernizing the industry. But then I actually met you." She looked up from her tablet, meeting his eyes. You weren't just another acquisition, Jack. You showed me that real innovation comes from love. Love of the land, love of the work, love of... She trailed off as the emergency lights flashed green. Their adjustments were working. The water flow stabilizing, but neither of them moved to leave the workshop. I forgave you, Jack said quietly. About the same time I realized I couldn't hate you for showing me what this ranch could become, what I could become. Through the window, they could see the storm beginning to weaken, the worst of the danger passing. But inside the workshop, something else was building, a different kind of storm, one that had been brewing between them since the day they'd met. So where does that leave us? Elena asked, her corporate confidence nowhere in sight, leaving just the woman who'd fallen in love with a rancher and his dreams. Thunder rolled in the distance, softer now, like the earth itself was holding its breath for his answer. Dawn broke over the Miller Ranch, revealing the storm's aftermath. The creek had returned to its banks, leaving behind evidence of its fury, but also proof of how well their combined innovations had protected the ranch. The modernized barn stood strong, the irrigation systems had held, and the cattle were safe in the upper pastures. Jack and Elena stood on his porch, watching the sunrise paint the wet landscape in shades of gold. Ranch hands were already out assessing damage, their movements confident and purposeful. This was no longer just Jack's father's ranch, or a Santos agricultural investment. It had become something entirely new. The board meeting starts in an hour, Elena said, looking at her phone. They're expecting me to present a complete withdrawal plan. She paused, then added softly, unless. Unless what? Unless we show them something different. She turned to face him fully. What happened last night? The way we worked together, the way everything we built held up against the storm. It proved something. We're better together, Jack. Not as a corporate takeover, not as a pilot program, but as true partners. Before Jack could respond, the sound of approaching vehicles caught their attention. Tom Henderson's truck led a small convoy of local ranchers down the drive. They'd come to assess the storm damage, no doubt expecting to find the Miller Ranch in ruins. Jack felt Elena tense beside him, but he took her hand, surprising them both. Together, they watched Tom and the others take in the scene, the intact buildings, the functioning systems, the safe cattle. The evidence of their success was undeniable. Looks like your fancy improvements held up, Tom said grudgingly, approaching the porch. They did, Jack agreed. Because they weren't just fancy improvements, Tom. They were innovations born from generations of ranching knowledge, given the resources they deserved. He looked at Elena. Some things have to change to stay true to what they've always been. The gathered ranchers murmured among themselves, looking with new eyes at the harmonious blend of traditional ranching and modern innovation before them. Jack recognized the moment for what it was. A turning point not just for him and Elena, but for the whole community. The Agricultural Innovation Conference called again, Elena said, loud enough for everyone to hear. They still want your presentation, Jack, but not just about the irrigation system now. They want to hear about everything we've built here. About how tradition and innovation can work together. Tom stepped forward, his expression conflicted. Those designs of yours, Miller, the water conservation system, would they work on other ranches around here? They would, Elena answered before Jack could. But they'd work better if we all worked together, share resources, knowledge, support each other instead of fighting change. Jack looked at the woman beside him, seeing not the corporate CEO who'd orchestrated their first meeting, but the partner who'd helped him realize his dreams. The storm had washed away their pretenses, leaving only truth behind. The board meeting, he said quietly to her. Tell them we have a new proposal. Elena's eyes widened. We, a real partnership. No corporate strategies, no hidden agendas. Just us, building something that matters. He turned to address the gathered ranchers. The Miller Ranch has always been about family. Maybe it's time we remembered that family can grow, can change, can become something bigger than we imagined. One by one, the ranchers nodded, even Tom Henderson looking thoughtful. They could all see it now. the future of ranching taking shape before them, not as a corporate takeover, but as a community evolution. Elena squeezed his hand, her professional mask completely gone. "Partner," she said, making it sound like much more than a business term. Jack pulled her closer, no longer caring who saw. "Partner," he agreed. Behind them, the rescued heifer called out from the pasture, as if adding her approval to their reunion. The sun climbed higher, lighting up the dew-covered land that had survived the storm stronger than before. Just like the ranch itself, Jack and Elena had weathered their own storm and emerged stronger, their love tested by truth and transformed by trust. The Miller Ranch would continue to evolve, to innovate, to grow, but now it would do so with roots planted firmly in both tradition and progress, guided by two people who had learned that the greatest innovations come not from corporate strategies or solitary pride, but from hearts brave enough to trust, to change, and to love. 6 months later, the Miller Ranch hummed with activity under a perfect Texas sky. The Agricultural Innovation Conference had set up their main stage right in front of the modernized barn, its solar panels gleaming in the sunlight. Ranchers from across the state filled the grounds, here to witness what the media was calling the future of traditional ranching. Jack stood at the podium, his work boots and ranch-worn jeans a stark contrast to the suits in the audience. But his voice carried with confidence as he explained how his irrigation systems had already helped 3 neighboring ranches reduce their water consumption by 40%. Elena watched from the side, pride shining in her eyes. She'd traded her corporate suits for practical ranch wear, though she still commanded the same respect she had in any boardroom. The Santos-Miller partnership had become a model for agricultural innovation, proving that progress didn't have to come at the cost of heritage. The rescued heifer grazed contentedly in the demonstration pasture, now the mother of a healthy calf of her own. Like the ranch itself, she'd thrived under the care of 2 people who'd learned to combine the best of their worlds. After the presentations, as the crowd mingled and explored the ranch's innovations, Jack found Elena by his father's old tractor, now restored and modified with their latest efficiency improvements. "Dad would have loved this," he said, running his hand along the familiar metal. "All these years, I thought I was just trying to save his legacy. Turns out I was building on it instead." Elena leaned into him, her engagement ring catching the sunlight. "He built the foundation. We just gave it room to grow." She nodded toward the gathering, where Tom Henderson was actually smiling as he discussed implementing Jack's water conservation system on his own ranch. The old grandfather clock from the house had been moved to the barn's new office, its steady ticking a reminder of how time moved both forward and back. Jack's innovations sat on shelves beside his father's old veterinary books, while Elena's corporate acumen had found a home among generations of Miller Ranch wisdom. Maria approached them, carrying a framed article from the State Agriculture Journal. The headline read, "Miller Ranch Revolution: How Love, Innovation, and Tradition Saved Texas Ranching." She hung it beside the old family photos, completing a wall that told the story of a legacy not just preserved, but enhanced. As the sun set over their transformed ranch, Jack and Elena stood on the porch where they'd weathered their storm, both literal and emotional. The land stretched out before them, as it had for generations of millers, but now it held the promise of a future neither of them could have imagined alone. "You know," Elena said, watching the first stars appear, "sometimes the best traditions are the ones we create together." Jack smiled, pulling her close. The evening breeze carried the scent of rain, not a threat anymore, but a promise of growth, of renewal, of love that had weathered truth and emerged stronger. Above them, the Texas sky stretched endless and free, just like the possibilities ahead.